The sky over Millbrook cracked open on a Tuesday morning, and nothing about our town was ever the same again. I was walking to school with my earbuds in when the shadow fell across the road. Not a cloud shadow. A shadow with edges, sharp and metal, stretching from one side of Maple Street to the other. I looked up and saw the belly of a ship so large it blotted out the sun completely. The birds went silent first. Then the car alarms started, one after another, until the whole street was screaming in electronic panic. My name is Mira Osei. I was 16 years old on the day the Zarkesh arrived, and I remember every second of it the way you remember the moment right before you fall down the stairs, when your body already knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. The ship did not land so much as it settled, the way a heavy stone settles into wet sand. The ground shook under my sneakers. I dropped my backpack without meaning to and grabbed the fence beside me just to stay standing. Around me, people were running, but I could not make my legs move. I stood there staring at the enormous hull, dull gray and scratched, like it had crossed 1,000 battles to get here, and I felt something strange settle into my chest alongside the fear. I felt curious. Even then, even with my knees shaking, some part of me wanted to know how something that big could fly. By the time I got to school, soldiers were already standing in the parking lot. They were tall, taller than any human I had ever seen, with skin the color of wet clay and joints that bent in places human joints did not bend. They wore armor plates that looked like they had been grown rather than built, curved and layered like insect shells. They did not shout. They did not need to. They simply stood there, weapons resting easily in their hands, and the silence they created was louder than any siren. Principal Duran tried to speak to them. I watched from behind a parked car as she walked toward the largest one, her hands raised, her voice shaking but steady. The soldier looked down at her the way you might look down at an insect that had wandered onto your shoe. He did not answer. He simply pointed at the school doors, and that gesture alone was enough to send 400 students filing back inside, in total silence. That was the first thing I learned about the Zarkesh. They did not need to yell to be terrifying. Their silence did the yelling for them. Word came in whispers through the hallways before any teacher confirmed it out loud. Our school had been chosen, not because of anything special about Millbrook, but because we sat near a crossroads, a place where 3 highways met, a place useful for moving large machines quickly in any direction. Someone in the administration building had made a decision about our town the way you might make a decision about a parking lot, and none of us had been asked. By noon, the gymnasium had been cleared of every mat and every basketball hoop. By 2 in the afternoon, 3 enormous vehicles the soldiers called ground tanks rolled onto the football field, crushing the goalposts flat without slowing down. I watched from the science room window as the grass turned to churned mud beneath treads taller than a grown man. Even from that distance, I could feel the vibration through the floor tiles under my shoes. That evening, they called an assembly. Not the kind with a microphone and folding chairs. The kind where soldiers walk through your neighborhood block by block and knock on every door with the butt of a weapon until every family stands together in the street. I stood between my mother and my little brother Kwame, my arms wrapped around my textbooks because I had nowhere else to put my hands. Priya found us in the crowd and pressed close to my side without saying anything. We had been best friends since 3rd grade, and in that moment we did not need words. Her hand found mine and squeezed once, hard. At the front of the crowd, on a raised platform that had definitely not existed that morning, stood the one they called General Vos Catherine. He was different from the other soldiers. Where they wore plain armor, his was etched with patterns that caught the streetlight, gold lines running along dark plates like veins of lightning frozen in metal. He was taller than the rest, and he moved like someone who had never once in his life been told to wait his turn. A small drone hovered near his shoulder, translating his words into a flat, buzzing version of English that still somehow carried the weight of his contempt. He told us that resistance would not be tolerated. He told us that our world had been added to a list of territories under Zarkesh observation, and that our behavior over the coming weeks would determine how much freedom we would be permitted to keep. He said the word freedom the way you might say a joke you did not find funny. Then he said something that would follow me for the rest of my life. He said that his scientists had studied our planet before landing, that they had measured our gravity, our atmosphere, the strength of our bones, and the pull of our sun. He said all of it in the bored tone of someone reading a shopping list. And then he smiled, if you could call it a smile, his mouth stretching in a way that showed too many teeth. He said that we had grown soft. He said that a species raised under gravity as weak as ours could never understand true strength, that on his homeworld, children were raised under pull more than twice what we felt beneath our feet, and that by the time a Zarkesh child could walk, they could already lift weight that would crush a grown human flat. He said humans were the softest species his people had ever conquered, and that our world would fall not because we were dangerous, but because we were fragile, like flowers that wilted the moment real pressure was applied. I felt my mother's hand tighten around mine. I felt Kwame press closer against my side. And I felt something else too, something quieter, something that did not show on my face at all. I felt anger, the slow burning kind that does not shout, the kind that just sits in your stomach and waits. Voss stepped down from the platform and walked toward one of the tanks parked at the edge of the field, the metal beast idling with a low mechanical growl that vibrated in my teeth. He placed one clawed hand on its hull, almost affectionately, the way you might rest your hand on the back of a loyal animal. He told us this vehicle alone weighed more than every car in our town combined. He told us that no human alive could move it even 1 inch, not with ropes, not with machines, not with every person in Millbrook pushing at once. He said it as fact, the way you might say the sky is blue or the ocean is salty. Nobody argued, nobody dared to. The crowd stood in silence, 400 families staring at their shoes, and I remember thinking that this was exactly what he wanted. Not obedience born from agreement, but obedience born from believing you had already lost before you tried. That night, after curfew was announced and soldiers took up positions on every corner, my mother sent Kwame to bed early and sat with me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She did not talk about the invasion. She talked about my father instead. My father had been an engineer, the kind who saw the world as a puzzle of forces and levers rather than a fixed and finished thing. Before the accident that took him from us 3 years earlier, he had spent every weekend in our garage working on something he called the exosuit, a frame of metal and hydraulics meant to let an ordinary person lift far more than their body should allow. He used to say that humans were never the strongest animals on Earth, not compared to ants carrying many times their own weight, not compared to elephants or bears. He used to say that what made humans dangerous was not strength. It was the refusal to accept that strength was the only answer. He never finished the exosuit. After he was gone, my mother could not bring herself to move it, and it had sat under a tarp in the corner of our garage ever since, gathering dust, forgotten by everyone except me. I had not thought about it in months. But sitting there that night, replaying the sound of General Voss's voice telling 400 people that they were too weak to matter, I found myself thinking about that half-built machine under its dusty tarp for the first time in a long while. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tank crushing the goalposts flat. I saw the general's too wide smile. I heard him say the word soft, like it was a sentence being handed down. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and lay staring at the ceiling instead, listening to the distant hum of alien engines idling on streets that used to belong only to us. I thought about my father's voice, patient and certain, explaining leverage to me when I was 10 years old, using nothing more than a broomstick and a brick. I thought about how he used to say that a lever long enough could move the whole world, and that the trick was never about being the strongest thing in the room. The trick was about understanding forces better than everyone else did. I did not have a plan yet, not really, but somewhere in the dark, staring at my bedroom ceiling while alien machines rested their treads in the mud of our football field, a single quiet thought took root in my mind and refused to leave. He said no human could move that tank. He had never met anyone from Millbrook. 3 days after the assembly, General Voss decided to make an example of us in front of the entire town, and it was Priya who paid the price for it. The soldiers had started patrolling the streets in pairs, walking slowly past houses with their strange bending joints and their silent eyes, as if daring anyone to step outside the lines they had drawn. School had resumed, but it did not feel like school anymore. Half the classrooms had been turned into storage for alien equipment, and every hallway echoed with the heavy footsteps of guards who watched us eat lunch like we were animals in an exhibit. That morning, General Voss called another gathering, this time smaller, just the families who lived closest to the school. He stood beside one of his tanks again, the same one from before, its gold-trimmed hull gleaming under the gray morning sky. He announced that he wanted to demonstrate, once more, the difference between his people and ours. He ordered 2 of his soldiers to lift the front end of an abandoned pickup truck that had been left near the field since the first day. They did it without strain, without effort, as if the truck weighed nothing more than a cardboard box. The crowd gasped, and Voss allowed himself a slow, satisfied nod, the kind of nod that said this was exactly the reaction he had been hoping for. Then he turned to the crowd and asked, through his translator drone, if any human wished to try. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be humiliated in front of the whole street, but Priya, standing near the front with her older brother, must have felt something snap inside her, because before I could stop her, she stepped forward. I remember grabbing at the air where her sleeve had been a second earlier, too slow to catch her. She did not say anything defiant. She did not make a speech. She simply walked toward the truck and placed both hands under the bumper and pushed with everything she had. Her arms shook. Her face turned red with effort. The truck did not move even a fraction of an inch. One of the soldiers stepped forward and shoved her aside, not violently, but with enough force that she stumbled and fell onto the pavement, scraping her palms and knees. General Voss laughed, a strange clicking sound that his translator did not bother to soften, and told the crowd this was proof of everything he had already said. He said watching a human attempt strength was like watching a child attempt to move a mountain, amusing but ultimately pointless. I ran to Priya before anyone else could reach her. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger, the same slow-burning kind I had felt building in my own chest since the night of the first assembly. I helped her up, and she looked at me with tears in her eyes that were not sad tears at all. She whispered that she hated feeling powerless more than she hated anything else in the world. I understood exactly what she meant, because I had been feeling the same thing since the moment that shadow first crossed Maple Street. That night, I could not stop thinking about her scraped palms, about the sound of that clicking laugh, about the casual way 2 soldiers had lifted a truck as if it were nothing at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, and somewhere around midnight, I got up, pulled on a jacket over my pajamas, and walked quietly down to the garage. The tarp covering my father's exosuit had gathered a fine layer of dust, and when I pulled it back, the frame beneath looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, more unfinished. It was a skeleton of metal struts and hydraulic tubing, shaped roughly like a human body but stripped down to its essential bones. Half the wiring hung loose. One of the leg joints was missing entirely, replaced by nothing more than a gap where my father had clearly meant to add something he never got the chance to build. I ran my hand along the frame, the way I used to watch my father do, tracing the joints, remembering the way he explained each one. He used to tell me that the human body was already an incredible machine, full of natural leverage most people never thought about. Every time you bend your elbow, he said, your muscle is doing far more work than the force you actually feel at your hand, because your tendons attach close to the joint, sacrificing raw power for speed and range of motion. He said that if you built a machine that worked with the body, instead of trying to replace it, if you multiplied the force at exactly the right point in each joint, you could take an ordinary person and let them do something extraordinary, not by making them stronger inside, but by changing how their strength reached the outside world. He called it force redirection. He used to draw diagrams on napkins at the kitchen table, arrows bending around joints like rivers bending around rocks. Standing in that garage at midnight, staring at his unfinished machine, I understood something for the first time. General Voss had bragged about his people's raw strength, about muscles built for gravity twice as strong as ours. But strength like that was simple. It was direct. It did not require cleverness, only mass and force. My father's machine was not about matching that kind of strength. It was about proving that raw power was never the only path to moving something heavy. Sometimes the answer was not to be the strongest thing in the room. Sometimes the answer was to understand the room better than anyone else did. I spent the rest of that night sketching in an old notebook, trying to remember every explanation my father had ever given me, trying to piece together what pieces the frame was still missing. By the time the sun came up, I had a list 3 pages long, and for the first time since the ships arrived, I felt something other than fear sitting in my chest. I felt purpose. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I asked my robotics club for help, not with a school project, but with something real. We met in Mr. Halloway's classroom during lunch. The 6 of us who made up the entire robotics club huddled around a table meant for 4. Leo Bramwell, who could fix almost any motor with nothing more than a screwdriver and patience. Grace Denholm, who understood circuits the way other people understood breathing, effortlessly and without needing to think about it. Noah Ferris, quiet but sharp, always the one who noticed the flaw nobody else had spotted. And Sophia Calant, who had built our club's competition robot almost single-handedly the year before. I did not tell them everything at first. I only told them I needed help finishing a project my father had left behind, something that used force redirection to multiply human strength. I watched their faces shift from confusion to curiosity, and I felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was not a completely impossible idea. Grace asked the obvious question first. She asked why, out of nowhere, 3 years after his passing, I suddenly needed to finish my father's unfinished invention. I told her the truth. I told her about Priya's scraped palms. I told her about the sound of that laugh. I told her that I was tired of watching my town be told it was too soft to matter, and that I wanted, just once, to prove General Voss wrong in front of everyone who had been forced to watch him prove himself right. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Leo asked when we could start. We agreed to meet at my garage after school, away from patrols, away from watching eyes. We agreed to keep it a secret from everyone, even our families, because the streets were no longer safe for gathering openly, and because if the soldiers ever discovered what we were building, the consequences would be far worse than a scraped knee. Walking home that afternoon, I passed the football field again, the crushed goalpost still lying flat in the mud, the tank still idling with that low mechanical growl. I looked at the one with the gold-trimmed markings, the one General Voss had called impossible to move, and for the first time since the ships arrived, I did not feel afraid when I looked at it. I felt something closer to a challenge accepted. That evening, my mother noticed the dust on my jacket sleeves and the tired circles under my eyes, and she asked, gently, what I had been doing in the garage so late at night. I almost told her everything. I almost let the whole plan spill out across the kitchen table, the way it had spilled out of me to my robotics club that afternoon. Instead, I told her I had been thinking about Dad, and that felt true enough not to be a lie. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same way Priya had done in the crowd days earlier, and she told me that some nights she thought about him too, especially the way he used to say that every problem had a solution. You simply had to be patient enough to find it. I went to bed that night with my notebook full of half-finished sketches sitting on my desk, and for the first time since the shadow first crossed Maple Street, I fell asleep quickly, my mind already racing ahead to tomorrow, to scrap metal and salvaged parts, and the slow, careful work of building something my father never got the chance to finish. Somewhere out on the football field, a tank sat idling in the mud, gleaming with gold-trimmed armor, utterly certain that no human hands would ever move it. It had no idea what was coming. The next few weeks became a strange double life. one where I woke each morning pretending to be an ordinary student under occupation, and each night became someone entirely different, someone building a machine in secret that might get us all in serious trouble if it was ever discovered. Our first real problem was materials. My father's frame was strong in concept but weak in reality, missing hydraulic lines, missing half its joint housings, missing the kind of precise electronic control system that could make thousands of tiny adjustments per second without a human even noticing. We were 6 teenagers with a robotics club budget that barely covered spare batteries, trying to finish a project that would have challenged a full engineering team with proper funding. Leo suggested we start with what the town already had lying around, forgotten and half-broken in garages and storage sheds. Millbrook had always been a town of mechanics and machinists, farmers who fixed their own tractors, families who kept old car parts around for decades just in case. Within our first week, we had quietly collected hydraulic cylinders from an old car lift in Noah's uncle's garage, servo motors salvaged from a broken factory robot arm that had been sitting behind the hardware store for years, and thick cabling stripped from equipment nobody used anymore. Grace turned out to be the one who solved our biggest challenge. She pointed out that our control system did not need to be built entirely from scratch, because pieces of alien technology, damaged and discarded, had started appearing around town after skirmishes between resistance groups and Zarkish patrols in the surrounding countryside. We had all heard rumors of these skirmishes, quiet battles fought far from Millbrook by people the news never named, but the proof of them showed up sometimes in the fields outside town, in the twisted metal of drones that had been shot down and left where they fell. It took real courage to go looking for that wreckage. The countryside beyond Millbrook was not safe, potholed irregularly by soldiers on hovering platforms, watched from above by scout drones that could report any unusual movement within seconds. But Sophia knew the back trails better than anyone, having grown up on a farm at the edge of town, and she agreed to guide us on quiet, careful trips after dark, always in pairs, always ready to freeze and hide the moment we heard the whine of an engine overhead. I remember the first time we found real alien technology up close. It was the wreck of a small reconnaissance drone, half buried in a ditch beside an overgrown field, its outer shell cracked open like an egg. Grace knelt beside it with a flashlight covered in red cellophane to dim the glow, and I watched her hands shake slightly as she carefully pried loose a component no bigger than a deck of cards, a strange crystalline block that pulsed faintly even though the drone around it was completely dead. She told us later, back in my garage with the door locked and towels stuffed under the gap to block the light, that the component appeared to be some kind of adaptive processor, capable of reading physical strain in real time and adjusting output thousands of times faster than anything human built. If she was right, and if she could figure out how to interface it safely with our hydraulic system, it could become the exact kind of control system my father's exosuit had always been missing. It took her nearly 2 weeks of careful, frustrating trial and error to make that connection work. There were nights she left my garage in tears, convinced she had fried the component permanently, only to return the next evening with a new idea scribbled on a torn notebook page, determined to try again. I never once saw her give up completely, even on the worst nights, and I think that stubbornness was exactly what saved the project more than once. While Grace worked on the brain of the machine, Leo and Noah focused on its body. The hardest part, they told me one evening, was not making the frame strong enough to survive the forces it would need to handle. Steel and salvaged hydraulics could handle plenty of force if built correctly. The hardest part was making sure that force reached the ground evenly, so that when I finally stood inside the suit and pushed against something heavy, the frame would not simply buckle or twist under the strain. Noah spent 3 entire nights just calculating angles, sketching diagrams that looked almost exactly like the ones I remembered my father drawing years earlier. Arrows curving around joints, numbers scrawled in the margins. He explained it to me once, patiently, the way you might explain something to someone you actually respected, rather than someone you were simply tolerating. He said that the suit worked like a system of levers layered on top of each other, hip to knee to ankle, each joint multiplying force a little more before passing it down to the ground, so that by the time the force reached my feet, it had been amplified far beyond what my own muscles alone could ever produce. I asked him what would happen if one of those layers failed while I was using it. He did not sugarcoat the answer. He told me the frame could snap, or worse, that the sudden release of stored force could seriously hurt me. He said the only way to make it safe was to test everything slowly, gradually, never pushing the suit further than we had already proven it could handle. That warning stayed with me every single night after that, a quiet reminder tucked behind every bolt we tightened and every wire we soldered. Sophia became our test pilot for the early trials, not because she volunteered eagerly, but because she was the smallest and lightest among us, which meant if something went wrong, the forces involved would be smaller too. I remember the first time she stood inside the half-finished frame in my garage, the hydraulics groaning as Grace slowly increased power through a laptop connected by a tangle of wires. Sophia lifted a stack of cinder blocks that should have been far too heavy for her, her face lighting up with a mixture of fear and disbelief as her arms trembled, not from strain, but from the strange sensation of feeling powerful for the very first time. The blocks rose smoothly into the air, and for a moment, none of us said anything at all. We simply stood there, staring at something my father had only ever managed to sketch on napkins finally becoming real in front of us. It was not perfect, far from it. The suit overheated after only a few minutes of continuous use. One of the leg joints locked up entirely during our third trial, trapping Sophia in place until Leo managed to manually override the hydraulic pressure with a wrench and a great deal of patience. We learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, exactly where the frame's weaknesses were hiding. Word almost got out twice during those weeks, and both times my heart nearly stopped. The first time, a patrol passed unusually close to my street around midnight, their heavy footsteps echoing off the pavement just as Grace was running a particularly loud test on the hydraulic pump. We killed the power instantly and sat frozen in complete darkness for almost 20 minutes, barely breathing, listening to those footsteps pause directly outside my garage door, before finally continuing on down the street. Nobody spoke a word until we were absolutely certain the patrol was gone. The second time was worse. Priya's older brother noticed her sneaking out one evening to help us gather supplies, and for one terrifying day, we thought he might report us out of fear for her safety, rather than any loyalty to the occupation. Instead, once Priya explained everything to him in private, he became one of our most valuable allies, using his old truck to help transport heavier scrap parts under the cover of darkness, always parking 2 streets away just in case anyone was watching. Slowly, piece by piece, night after night, the exosuit began to look less like my father's abandoned dream and more like something that might actually work. There was one evening, about 3 weeks into the project, when I finally understood just how much we had actually built. I stood in the garage alone after everyone else had gone home, staring at the completed frame standing upright against the wall, its metal plates catching the dim light of a single hanging bulb. It no longer looked fragile. It looked like something with purpose, something waiting patiently for someone to finally put it to real use. I ran my hand along the same joint I had touched that very first midnight, and I thought about my father, about how proud he would have been to see his unfinished sketches finally standing in 3 dimensions, built not by his own hands, but by mine, and by 5 friends who had trusted me enough to spend weeks of their lives on an idea that could have gotten all of us in serious danger. We still had problems left to solve. The suit's power supply remained unreliable, prone to sudden drops that could leave a wearer stranded mid-motion. We had not yet tested it against anything close to the actual weight of an alien tank, and privately, I worried that everything we had built might still fall apart the moment it faced a real challenge instead of a stack of cinder blocks in a quiet garage. But for the first time since the shadow first crossed Maple Street weeks earlier, I allowed myself to believe that General Voss's certainty might not be as unshakable as he thought. He had told an entire town that no human could ever move his tank, not with ropes, not with machines, not with every person in Millbrook pushing together at once. He had said it as simple, obvious fact, the same way you might say the sky is blue. Standing there alone in my garage, staring at a machine built from stolen alien technology and salvaged farm equipment, and 3 years of a father's unfinished love letter to leverage and force, I found myself smiling for the first time in what felt like a very long while. He had never actually tested that claim. He had simply assumed it was true because nobody had ever dared to challenge him. We were about to change that. The final piece fell into place on a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 1 month after the ships first darkened our sky. Grace finally solved the power stability issue by rerouting the alien processor through a secondary battery system Leo had scavenged from an old electric farm vehicle, and when she powered the full suit on for the first time, with all systems connected, the frame lit up with a soft blue glow along its joints, steady and strong, holding without a single flicker. We all stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the machine standing fully assembled in the middle of my garage for the very first time. Sophia was the one who finally broke the silence. She turned to me and asked, quietly, whether I was ready to actually test it against something that mattered. I looked at the suit, at the faint blue glow tracing along its joints, at the reflection of 5 tired but hopeful faces gathered around me in the dim garage light. I told her I did not know if I was ready, but I told her I was certainly willing to find out. The chance we needed came sooner than any of us expected, and it arrived wrapped in the worst possible circumstances. 2 days after Grace finished the power system, word spread through Millbrook that General Voss had ordered another public gathering, this time centered on my science teacher, Mr. Dunmore, a quiet, patient man who had been caught passing handwritten notes between families whose houses had been separated by new checkpoints. It was a small act of kindness, nothing more than helping neighbors stay in touch with loved ones on the other side of town. Under Zarkish rule, it was treated as defiance. I heard the news standing in my kitchen, my mother's hand pressed over her mouth as the announcement crackled through a speaker mounted on a drone, hovering slowly down our street. Mr. Dunmore would be brought before the town at sunset. General Voss intended to make him another example, the way he had made an example of Priya weeks earlier, except this time the punishment would be far more severe, meant to remind everyone exactly what defiance would cost. I did not have time to feel afraid. I only had time to move. I called Leo, Grace, Noah, and Sophia from the landline in our kitchen, keeping my voice low even though my mother already stood right beside me, having finally learned everything about the exosuit only minutes earlier, when I realized I could no longer keep it hidden from her. She did not yell. She did not tell me it was too dangerous, though I could see the fear behind her eyes. She simply asked me if I believed it would actually work. I told her I believed it was our only chance to prove General Voss wrong before someone we cared about got seriously hurt. She hugged me tightly, longer than she had hugged me in years, and then she helped me carry pieces of the suit out to Priya's brother's truck herself. We arrived at the edge of the football field just as the sun began sinking low behind the crushed goalposts, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The crowd had already gathered, forced there by patrols moving door to door exactly as they had done during the first assembly weeks earlier. Mr. Dunmore stood on the raised platform beside General Voss, his hands bound in front of him, his usually calm face pale and tight, with fear he was clearly trying hard not to show. Voss began speaking through his translator drone, the same bored, contemptuous tone I remembered from that very first night. He explained, slowly and deliberately, that defiance would always be met with consequence, and that Mr. Dunmore's punishment would serve as a lesson for anyone else considering similar acts of rebellion. We hid the suit's separate pieces beneath a large tarp behind the equipment shed at the edge of the field, exactly where Sophia had scouted 2 nights earlier during one of our supply runs. My hands shook as Leo and Noah helped me into the frame piece by piece, tightening straps, checking connections, working as quickly and quietly as possible while the crowd's attention stayed fixed on the platform. Grace knelt beside the small control panel mounted on my forearm, her fingers flying across it as she brought each system online one at a time, careful not to trigger the soft blue glow too early, and risk drawing attention before we were ready. I could hear General Voss's voice carrying across the field, announcing that Mr. Dunmore would be made to stand in front of the very tank he had claimed no human could ever move, as a symbol of exactly how powerless resistance truly was against Zarkesh's strength. That was the moment I stopped shaking. I stepped out from behind the equipment shed with the suit fully powered, its joints glowing faintly blue in the fading evening light, and I began walking straight toward the platform. The crowd noticed me before the soldiers did. A murmur rippled through the gathered families, heads turning, voices rising in confused whispers as 400 people watched a 16-year-old girl in a strange glowing metal frame walk calmly across a field that had been crushed flat by alien treads weeks earlier. General Voss noticed next. He turned toward me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, somewhere between confusion and irritation, as if he could not quite understand what he was looking at, or why it dared to interrupt him. I did not stop walking until I stood directly beside the very tank he had bragged about during that very first assembly, the one with the gold-trimmed markings, the one he had said no human could move even 1 inch. I looked up at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone around me could hear it, and I told him, as clearly and steadily as I could manage, that he was wrong. His translator drone buzzed as it converted my words, and for a moment, the entire field went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then General Voss laughed, that same clicking sound I remembered from the day he humiliated Priya, and he told the crowd this was even more amusing than before, a human child in a broken machine, believing she could accomplish what an entire town had already been proven incapable of. He gestured toward 2 of his soldiers, ordering them to remove me from the field before I embarrassed myself further, but I did not wait for them to reach me. I bent my knees, feeling the frame's hydraulics respond instantly beneath me, and I pushed my hands underneath the tank's front edge exactly where Noah had calculated the leverage point would be strongest. The suit's joints screamed with strain, a high-pitched mechanical whine that rose above even the murmuring crowd. I felt the force traveling down through my arms, through the frame's careful layers of amplified leverage, hip to knee to ankle, exactly as Noah had explained weeks earlier in my garage. My own muscles burned with an effort far beyond anything I had ever felt before, sweat immediately beading across my forehead despite the cool evening air. For 1 terrifying second, nothing happened. The tank remained perfectly still, its enormous weight refusing to yield, and I heard a small metallic pop somewhere near my left knee joint that sent a spike of panic through my chest. Then, slowly, impossibly, the front edge of the tank began to lift. The crowd's murmuring erupted into gasps. I heard someone scream, not in fear, but in disbelief. I kept pushing, my entire body shaking with the effort, the suit's frame groaning under strain that Noah had warned me could snap the joints entirely if pushed too far. I did not stop. I could not stop. Not with Mr. Dunmore standing frozen on the platform behind me, not with 400 people watching to see whether General Voss's certainty was actually as unshakable as he had claimed. The tank's front treads rose fully off the ground, mud dripping from beneath them, the entire massive vehicle tilting backward under the leverage the suit had generated. I held it there, arms trembling, breath coming in ragged gasps, for 3 full seconds that felt like an eternity. Then I carefully lowered it back down, the treads settling into the churned mud with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo across the silent field. I straightened up slowly inside the frame, my chest heaving, and I turned to face General Voss directly. His expression had changed completely. The bored contempt was gone, replaced by something I had never expected to see on his face. Genuine shock. Behind him, several of his soldiers had lowered their weapons slightly, staring at me with what looked almost like uncertainty. I did not say anything clever. I did not deliver some grand speech about human resilience or the power of determination. I simply stood there, breathing hard, letting the silence stretch out exactly the way General Voss's silence had once stretched out over our entire town on that very first night. For the first time since the shadow crossed Maple Street a month earlier, it was his turn to have no answer ready. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. The field stayed silent, except for the low idle of the other tanks and the faint hiss of steam rising from my suit's overworked joints. I stood there, chest still heaving, watching General Voss try to rebuild the composure I had just knocked loose in front of his own soldiers and half the town. He recovered faster than I expected. He always did. He straightened to his full height, adjusted the gold-trimmed plates along his shoulders, and told the crowd, through his buzzing translator, that one trick proved nothing. He said machines could be built to do many things, and that a single lucky demonstration did not change the fundamental truth about human weakness. I felt anger flare in my chest at those words, but I also felt something steadier underneath it, something my father might have called patience. I did not need to argue with him. The tank had already spoken for me. He ordered his soldiers to release Mr. Dunmore, not out of mercy, I think, but because he needed time to decide how to respond to what had just happened in front of so many witnesses. 2 soldiers cut the bindings from my teacher's wrists and pushed him roughly toward the crowd, where Priya's brother caught him before he could stumble to the ground. Mr. Dunmore looked at me as he passed, his eyes wide with something between gratitude and disbelief, and I gave him the smallest nod I could manage, still too breathless to speak. Voss turned back to me one final time. He told me, in that same flat and buzzing translation, that I should enjoy my small moment, because moments like this changed nothing in the end. He said empires were not built on emotion, and that whatever I had proven tonight would be forgotten the moment his forces moved forward with their plans regardless. I did not answer him. I simply powered down the suit's more aggressive systems, letting the blue glow along its joints fade to a soft, steady pulse, and I turned and walked back across the field toward my friends, who were waiting exactly where I had left them, their faces caught somewhere between terror and disbelief that any of this had actually worked. We did not celebrate that night, not really. We were too exhausted, too aware that soldiers had watched everything unfold and that consequences might still follow even though Mr. Dunmore had been released. Leo and Noah helped me out of the suit's frame in careful silence, checking each joint for damage, while Grace monitored the readings on her small salvaged laptop, her lips pressed into a thin, worried line as she noted every strained connection that would need repair before the suit could be used again. It was Sophia who finally spoke, once the suit had been carefully wrapped back in its tarp and loaded into the truck bed for the quiet drive home. She said, quietly, that no matter what happened next, something had changed tonight in a way that could not be undone. She was right, though none of us understood exactly how right, until the following days unfolded. News of what happened on that field did not stay contained to Millbrook. I do not know exactly how it spread, whether through a resistance network Priya's brother had connections to, or through travelers passing along the highway crossroads that had made our town valuable to the Zarkesh in the first place. But within a week, stories were circulating through neighboring towns about a girl who had lifted an alien tank with her bare hands in front of an entire occupying army. The story grew with every retelling, the way stories always do. By the time it reached towns 3 counties over, some versions claimed I had lifted the tank without any machine at all, using nothing but sheer human willpower. Others claimed I had thrown the tank clear across the field. I never corrected any of it, because the exaggerations mattered less than the truth underneath them, the simple fact that someone had finally proven General Voss's certainty wrong in front of witnesses who could not be silenced. What mattered more than the story itself was what it did to people who heard it. Resistance groups that had been operating in scattered, isolated pockets throughout the region began finding ways to coordinate more openly, emboldened by proof that human ingenuity could match Zarkesh's strength when applied with enough patience and creativity. Families who had grown quietly resigned to occupation began finding small ways to push back, hiding supplies from patrols, passing information along more carefully guarded routes, teaching their own children the kind of quiet defiance that does not announce itself loudly but refuses to disappear entirely either. General Voss's superiors noticed too, and not in a way that worked in his favor. I learned later, through channels I still do not fully understand, that Voss had built his entire reputation among Zarkish command on the idea that human worlds were among the easiest conquests his empire had ever encountered, soft and fragile, exactly as he had described us during that very first assembly. A single demonstration on a crushed football field in a small crossroads town had undone weeks of careful reporting meant to secure him greater command over the wider occupation. His superiors did not appreciate discovering that his confident assessments had been proven publicly, humiliatingly wrong. 3 weeks after that evening on the field, a new transport ship arrived over Millbrook, smaller than the massive vessels that had first darkened our sky. I watched from my bedroom window as General Voss was escorted aboard it under guard, his gold-trimmed armor stripped of several markings I had noticed during our confrontation. Markings I later learned represented rank and honor within his command structure. He did not look toward the town as he boarded. He did not look toward the football field where his certainty had first cracked open in front of 400 witnesses. I never learned exactly what became of him afterward, whether he faced further consequence from his own people or simply faded into obscurity within a command structure that had little patience for costly mistakes. Part of me still wondered, in quiet moments, whether he ever understood exactly what he had gotten wrong that night, whether he ever grasped that his mistake was never underestimating our machines, but underestimating our willingness to build them in the first place. Occupation did not end that night, and I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though one dramatic moment solved everything. It did not. Soldiers still patrolled our streets in the weeks and months that followed. Checkpoints remained. Curfews continued. The tanks stayed parked on our crushed football field for a long time afterward, though I noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that soldiers began treating that particular field with a strange kind of caution they had not shown before. But something fundamental had shifted, something that mattered more than any single battle or any single machine. People stopped believing they were as powerless as General Voss had once convinced them to feel. My robotics club grew after that night, quietly and carefully, as more students found their way into our garage sessions, eager to learn the same kind of patient, creative engineering that had built the suit in the first place. We never built another exosuit exactly like the first one, but we built other things, smaller tools and devices that found their way into resistance networks throughout the region, each one carrying forward the same lesson my father had tried to teach me years earlier at our kitchen table with nothing more than a broomstick and a brick. Strength was never only about raw power. It was about understanding the forces around you well enough to bend them towards something better. Mr. Dunmore returned to teaching within days, quieter than before but no less patient with his students, and I noticed he began finding small, careful ways to work engineering principles into his science lessons that had nothing directly to do with the occupation, but everything to do with reminding students exactly what human ingenuity was capable of when given room to grow. Priya and I remained close through everything that followed, and she often joked that she had been the one who inspired the entire project in the first place, pushing uselessly against that pickup truck weeks before I ever pulled the tarp off my father's unfinished machine. I never argued with her about it, because in a very real way, she was right. Her scraped palms and her quiet, furious tears had been the spark that reminded me exactly what I needed to build. I kept the exosuit carefully maintained in our garage long after that night, repairing the strained joints, reinforcing the frame with lessons learned from its first real test. I did not use it often, because using it always drew attention we could not always afford, but I kept it ready, exactly the way my father had once kept his unfinished sketches ready for a future he never got to see arrive. Some evenings, standing alone in the garage after everyone else had gone home, I would run my hand along the same joint I had touched that very first midnight weeks earlier, and I would think about the exact moment the tank's front treads lifted off the muddy ground, about the silence that followed, about the way General Voss's certainty had cracked open in front of an entire town that had been told, over and over, that they were too soft and too fragile to matter. He had been wrong about gravity, he had been wrong about strength, but most importantly, he had been wrong about us. He assumed that a species raised beneath gentle gravity would never learn to lift what pressed against them. He never understood that humans had never needed heavier gravity to grow strong. We had always found our strength somewhere else entirely, in patience, in stubbornness, in the quiet refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible simply because nobody had tried hard enough yet to prove it otherwise. Millbrook was still under occupation when this story ends, and I will not pretend the fight was over simply because one general boarded one transport ship in quiet disgrace. But something had changed in the way people looked at the sky after that night, something that no amount of alien strength could easily undo. They had learned, the same way I learned it standing in my father's garage weeks earlier, that the true measure of strength was never about what your body could lift on its own. It was about what you were willing to build, patiently and stubbornly, until the impossible finally bent beneath your hands. And somewhere out on that crushed and muddy football field, beneath a sky that no longer felt quite as heavy as it once had, 400 people carried that lesson forward with them, one quiet act of defiance at a time.